Can you be obese and metabolically healthy? Can you be obese and it not lead to particular kinds of disease states we often see among those who are, shall we say, overweight or carry a lot of body fat? Well, let's find out what the evidence says and see how often exceptions are to the rule, and maybe if you might be one of them. So, this study was produced in or published in 2003, May of 2003, and it's a great analysis of multiple studies that I ran across recently. And here's what they found. So, metabolically healthy obesity is a misnomer. So, kind of giving things away here. Components of the metabolic syndrome linearly increase with BMI as a function of age and gender. So let's unpack that a little bit. The summary actually does a really good job. So basically, there are certain people that have been observed to be obese or to carry a lot of adipose tissue, and those persons sometimes seem to be disease free. You can check their blood pressure, their blood glucose, things like that, and they're just fine. Generally, what we're talking about with metabolic syndrome is someone with high blood pressure and some degree of insulin insensitivity, leading to high blood glucose values and high insulin values. So what they found is interesting and similar to what I've kind of observed with clients. Um, Again, some people seem to be okay, but basically what they found is that as you age and as you become bigger, the risk goes up. So kind of no shock there. So if you weigh 300 pounds as a man at 25, you may have no visible signs, no detectable signs of metabolic syndrome. However, once you get to a certain age, those disease states begin to come forth, they begin to manifest. Interestingly enough, this seems to be more delayed in women. So the more man you are, the earlier you're subject to these disease states. Women, it seems to be more delayed. So get down here in just a moment. So women were metabolically protected relative to men between the ages of 30 and 50 years. Probably this is menopause. Women's hormones are protective against metabolic disease, and this is why women. You've probably seen those of you that are coaches and those of you that have known people who work in medical practices. A woman with a that's say obese and the same BMI as a man at the same age, they're both 40 years old. The man's far more likely to have high blood pressure. The man's far more likely to have dysregulated blood glucose. The woman might only have gestational diabetes when she's pregnant or when she was pregnant, but otherwise she actually seems fine, shall we say. And then later on in life, you experience the problems. And so once you get to menopause, that's when the game kind of changes. Insulin sensitivity comes down, and the body becomes far more dysregulated. And for those of you that might be hearing this and thinking like, oh well, I'll lose the weight when I get 50. As any woman who has been through menopause will tell you, losing weight after when you're postmenopausal is going to be a lot more difficult than premenopausal. The time to start is always now. It does get harder to lose weight. It becomes more difficult to lose weight the older you get. It becomes more difficult to return back to a generally healthier state as you age. And so let's look a little bit more into the abstract here, or actually we'll go back to the summary. So metabolically healthy obesity is rare in subject with high BMI and declines with age. Again, as you age, you might have been healthy before, even at the same BMI, but you're going to develop hypertension typically or some degree of insulin insensitivity. Hypertension is the most common metabolic syndrome component in men, while in women, these components are seen at an older age than men for the same BMI. Again, men seem to be more subject to this. It's a bigger problem for men at a younger age. Metabolic health declines with age and BMI in nearly all these subjects. This cross-sectional study predicts that in men, early rise in blood pressure and actual hypertension precedes the subsequent emergence of additional components in the MS. What does this mean? It means that it starts with blood pressure and blood glucose dysregulation, but it leads to other things, right? These lead to kidney damage, heart damage, and eventually heart failure, things like that. Dementia is also associated, that sort of thing. The continuous weight-related change in MS components are used against dichotomization of obesity into normal/abnormal in terms of its metabolic and vascular sequels. Further, Because the harms of obesity may be delayed but significant, a permissive approach toward the metabolically healthy state appears ill-advised. What's this saying? It's saying that the woke nonsense saying that obesity is fine if you feel fine or if your present health markers say you're fine is okay. That's not okay. We have data indicate that you can get away with it for a while, but this really means that this is your chance to return back to a healthy state. Because once you've crossed that threshold, once you've become type 2 diabetic, you can reverse it. However, you're going to be someone who can acquire type 2 diabetes more easily for life. Once you've held a lot of fat cells, it's easier for you to gain fat again for life. Once you've done damage to your knees because of carrying excess weight, that damage is going to follow you for life. You may be largely asymptomatic. A lot of things in the body are. A lot of disease states, once you actually notice them, that's past the point where you can stop doing damage. The damage is done, and now you're more in damage management and trying to manage symptoms or things like that, because there's really not much that can be done for the disease state, or you're just sort of like, maybe making it pause and kind of living with it. So the abstract again does a pretty good job. This was a large study, by the way. So they looked at 19,000 subjects, and 14,000 of them had a relatively high BMI, an elevated BMI above what we would say would be healthy. Now, this is of course with the qualifier that these are of course not looking at athletic people who carry a lot of muscle mass. This does not really apply so much. And so, like, if you're someone that you could have a BMI of 25 and have abs or something like that. This obviously does not apply to you. This is talking about excessive adipose tissue. And one thing I want to bring up as well, because this has been well studied and able to do a video on it. They've studied specifically sumo wrestlers because they're like the most fat athletes that you can find. They have the highest amount of body fat, pretty much, even more than strongmen. And so they've looked they've done body scans and everything and found that they didn't carry adipose tissue in their abdomens like we see in a lot of people with metabolic disorders. They had regulated blood glucose. They had their hormone production was good. They actually were very, very healthy. But these individuals typically train every day. They train on a very regular basis. They're actually in very good cardiovascular shape. They do a lot of conditioning. They're very strong. They do weight training. And of course, they wrestle and things like that. These individuals, if they stop those activities, immediately become diseased. They enter into a disease state very rapidly, so they have to endure rapid weight loss to protect their health. In general, I wouldn't say that's the kind of commitment that most of us should be making. That's what you want to do. That's what you want to do. That's your risk to take. This study, however, is primarily dealing with persons who are actually, they're just overweight. They're not particularly active or inactive necessarily. They're overweight. They're not carrying that much body mass. They're not athletes. They're not athletic. And, like they're a typical person that's not actually that active necessarily or participating in anything that's that physically grueling. The number of metabolic syndrome components increased linearly with BMI. So as BMI went up, very predictably, metabolic syndrome basically crept up in all these individuals. The most prevalent components were hypertension in men and increased waist circumference in women, which increased waist circumference, basically a waist circumference above 40 inches, is very strongly associated with all sorts of negative health outcomes. And so it's actually been added to, it's not just a marker of metabolic syndrome. It's actually become like a diagnostic for metabolic syndrome, just like high blood glucose is, because of the level of risk that's been demonstrated to provide. Among non-obese subjects, there was a linear increase in blood pressure, glucose, and triglycerides, as well as a decline in high-density lipoprotein cholesterol. Now, I'm not going to be super worried about HDL going down, honestly. But triglycerides, yes, triglycerides are an indicator that cells are not getting energy the way that they should, and your body is liberating fats and lipids to try to burn. And also that, like, there's so much excess storage that your body's actually having a hard time putting it away in fat, and so those excess triglycerides are actually supposed to be used as fuel. But if they don't have anywhere to go because of your lack of insulin sensitivity, lack of metabolic efficiency of your cells, then they just float around in circulation and can turn into problems, particularly when in the presence of high blood pressure and high blood glucose. Because what's happening with high blood glucose and high blood pressure is it's damaging your arteries, it's damaging your blood vessels, and that's what leads to the accumulation of sticky triglycerides, shall we say. They're basically, it's a reaction. Imagine if you were to scratch the same part of your skin all day, every day, very slowly. Eventually, you'd wear it out. Then there'd be a scab, and then there'd be scar tissue, and then you'd have like fibrosis and problems like that. This is basically what's happening to the blood vessels. The elevated blood pressure is pushing on the walls too much and just causing slow damage and erosion over time like liquid would, right? And then the issue with blood glucose is it's a crystal and it's scoring, it's actually scratching the inside of your blood vessels. Now, as you can imagine, if you have high blood pressure plus high blood glucose at most of the time, you're basically pushing and scoring the inside of the blood vessel with more force. And so it's not the cholesterol that causes it, but rather the fact that you've got um, basically this damage to the inner wall of your blood vessels, and the accumulation that we see, the plaque and things like that, that is just trying to keep you from dying. That's otherwise because the tissue has basically failed at this point, and so it's like forming a scab or something similar. All right, back to it. Women were metabolically protected relative to men between the ages of 30 and 50 years, like we mentioned. Conclusions. Metabolic syndrome components increase linearly with BMI from the lowest normal BMI and continue to increase with age and BMI, meaning that the more woman you are, the younger you are, the more you can get away with this. As you age, you're going to see an increase in metabolic syndrome risk and eventually disease state. Again, the time to lose weight is now, because once the disease state begins to set in, weight loss becomes more challenging and return to the disease state is always easier going forward. Metabolically healthy obesity is rare in subject with a high BMI and declines with age. Hypertension is the most common component in men and women. MS components are seen at older ages than in men for the same BMI. Metabolic health declines with age and BMI in nearly all subjects with obesity. So that last statement is very important. Metabolic health declines with age and BMI in nearly all subjects with obesity, meaning that um, as your BMI is higher, the older you are, the more subject you are to a disease state. And it's insidious because the older you become, typically, the easier it is to gain weight because you become less active. Staying active, keeping a healthy diet, and having your lifestyle dialed in, if you will, is going to be the best way to ensure your longevity, far more than pills or anything like that, of course. And what I would say is if you're someone that's like okay with getting away with it right now, because you may very well be aware that eventually the hammer is going to drop, and when it does, it's going to stink. It's going to be a big bummer. You're going to be pressured to take a bunch of medications, which you probably should, at least to manage the disease state, but you should immediately resort to lifestyle interventions to remove yourself from this disease state and no longer have drug dependency, so that you don't actually need the drugs any longer and you're in a healthy state. But remember that what you're doing now is building toward your future. You are in a position right now, if you're someone who's obese, to take control and lose weight before you have metabolic disease, and it's easier now than when you acquire that disease. You don't want it to be easier forever for you to acquire that disease again. So why not start now? New Year's is just around the corner. Let's go. So if you want to talk to me about this, hire me or whatever, or go hire someone else. Get to work, get on the treadmill, go for walks, eat less food, eat high protein, and go lift some weights. Thanks a lot. If you found this helpful, please like, share, and subscribe, and reach out to me at highcallingfitness.com if you'd like to set up a consultation.